All right, everybody, welcome to the third part of the Undervalued video series, and today we're going to be starting with the New York Mets, who are a pretty interesting team for one big reason. They have the best reliever in all of baseball, and because he's on a very large deal and injured, he is also one of the most undervalued players in the entire game. Now, Edwin Diaz is probably not worth close to 20 million a year. Now, he is an excellent reliever. He does blow away the competition. I do think that in line starts, he is probably the best reliever in all of baseball. But the big thing about him, I'd say he's probably worth 12 and a half, 15 million a year on average throughout this contract. So he is overvalued, but not by that much. And obviously, you're losing most, if not all, of the first season. Yeah, it should be pretty much all of the first season to his injury, barring a lucky recovery. But ultimately, with Diaz, the Mets just undervalue him so heavily. You'd think he would be making far more than the money he actually is. So, in addition to Diaz, who is obviously an excellent player, but the cost of acquisition is just so negative that he's incredible value, you can get Kodai Senga for relatively cheap. Now, Senga is obviously the way I would compare him is Eduardo Rodriguez. I think Eduardo Rodriguez is an excellent player on a very solid contract. That's probably about his worth in general. Senga's better. He's just universally better than Erod, with more stamina. Ultimately, just a very, very good pitcher on the same contract with a relatively low cost of acquisition. But the weirdest part about the Mets to me is Brett Baty, whose cost of acquisition is ridiculously low, and he is opening day a very solid first baseman. Now, of course, he does not quite have his full batting potential yet. He does have room to grow, and at 23, it's going to be tough for him to hit it, but he only needs to develop a touch more, which is actually relatively common for him to become an incredibly talented player. So obviously, as you can see, you get the three of these players, and yeah, they do cost a little bit of money, but for pretty much nothing in Lourdes Gurriel Jr. Anyways, we'll go ahead and move on to our next team. Actually, before we hop into the Oakland Athletics, I realized I forgot a couple of players in the last video for the Yankees, so we're gonna actually go through them. First off is Michael King, who is a lot like Alex Lange, excuse me, in terms of his overall abilities and appeal. He's a very high stuff reliever who can work very well as a stopper in the back of your bullpen. Very or solid, not great movement and control as well. But if he develops just a tiny bit more stamina, he becomes a very good starting pitcher if you want to use him in that role. He's young-ish, cost-controlled, team-controlled, and cheap as well to acquire. So overall, great value. Next up is Clark Schmidt, who is probably going to be one of the most undervalued players in all of OOTP this year. For reference, I want to compare Clark Schmidt to Zach Gallen, which, for the record, I think this is absolutely ridiculous, but they have identical stuff, movement, and control in 24 right now. I don't know how this happened to OOTP, where a Cy Young contender gets the same ratings as Clark Schmidt, but sure. Anyways, as such, Clark Schmidt is absolutely a very high value trade, and obviously he's probably going to be a touch lower than Gallen in each stuff, movement and control. But regardless, the comparison stands where Clark Schmidt becomes a very clear high value target, low cost of acquisition, very solid upper middle rotation type starting pitcher. Next up is Oswaldo Cabrera, and I've been talking a lot about how second base is a really void position in terms of talent. Cabrera is actually one of the more solid options with decent second base defense, decent base running, decent bat, which is approximately league average overall. He's young, he's cheap, his cost of acquisition is next to nothing, and if you want, you can use him as a utility player. He's worth acquiring even to do that. Now, Frankie Montas, another solid middle rotation starting pitcher. He's got 1 year, 7.5 million. I like the Yankees actually think he's negative value, but he's only out for 3 to 4 months, so down the stretch run, he can absolutely help your team, and he is a solid pitcher to say the least once he's back from injury. Zach Green, a relatively cheap reliever to pick up right now. He's young, he's cheap, he's cost controlled, he comes at a very low cost of acquisition. He's a very solid middle reliever, all that stuff. And then Ron Mauricio, I hope I got close to his actual name's pronunciation. Same things as Green, a little bit pricier, a little bit better overall. A lot of these middle reliever types that you have available to you to choose from. So a lot of options. And of course, this whole package, very cheap overall. Definitely a solid option to trade for the Yankees right now. Anyways, with that said, we will go ahead and head on to the Oakland Athletics. All right, so a big thing to keep in mind is that with some teams, even if they're asking for next to nothing for their players, they actually have to have players of value to trade. And with the Oakland Athletics, it feels like you can get pretty much whatever you want from them. Uh, but the downside is, of course, that they actually have to have good players, and they really just do not have too many. Now, number one is Seth Brown. Seth Brown's biggest upside is cost of acquisition. Now, he is one of the few, and I mean this, there's actually not that many of these guys, fully developed corner outfielders with solid defense and an above average bat that you can get for next to nothing. And of course, he costs nothing to pay. He's pretty cheap right now. So it's very odd to me that the Oakland Athletics will deal him for so little. But if you're looking for a solid corner outfielder, Seth Brown is certainly going to be one of the best fits there. Hogan Harris, left-handed reliever who can also start pretty well. Very good stuff, solid movement, questionable control, but obviously that's going to be a very common theme with a lot of these high-value pitchers. Now, he can be used as a reliever. He can be used as a starter. He's solid, actually, in both roles. And cost of acquisition is very low. He's cheap as well, team controlled. And that's one of the things that surprises me the most about a lot of these players is for the most part, the best value players in OTP right now are team controlled and cheap, which has never been the case before. Those players tend to be well valued by the AI, but now they just really aren't. Anyways, next player is Zach Jackson. And he is another one of these high movement, high stuff, low control relievers who's solid middle reliever type, comes at a very cheap cost of acquisition. Next up is Christian Pache, who's been a favorite of mine for years in OTP. A big thing about Pache is the years of him being a quality hitter are gone. So now it's the cost of acquisition that's the big draw for him. He's pretty much got the same upside as Michael A. Taylor, albeit with a little bit worse hitting in general at the start of games, but the defense quality is absolutely still there. He's very cheap to get compared to a lot of the better center fielder options. So looking for a young center fielder who can stand in there, Pache is certainly worth considering still. JP Sears is in here for his cost of acquisition. He's not a bad bottom rotation starting pitcher if you just need someone in there to fill innings and costs absolutely nothing to get. Kirby Snead likewise costs absolutely nothing to get. He's a solid left-handed middle reliever, decent or strong stuff and movement with okay control. Just this type is all over the place, and that's pretty much it for the Oakland Athletics. So I believe the Philadelphia Phillies are next, and we will go ahead and head on to them. All right, with the Philadelphia Phillies, there's a lot of stuff to go through here, but ultimately the general theme is that there's plenty of value to be had. First off is Rafael Marchand, and I've been talking a lot again about how catchers tend to be expensive to acquire. Marchand is a switch hitter with a slightly below average bat and solid defense, who costs very little to get, so certainly a valuable target. Rhys Hoskins. Now, I'm not kidding when I say really aren't that many great first base options. He is considered undervalued by the Phillies. Yeah, he's out 8 months. I actually kind of missed that, to be quite honest. So you're pretty much taking on dead money here with Hoskins. But the benefit is that it makes a lot of trades easier, including for guys that we're going to see below. Brandon Marsh, pretty cheap cost of acquisition. He's a solid corner, or not corner outfielder, center fielder if you want a more of bat first potential type player or corner outfielder in general. Solid base running as well. He's not really the kind of player I would trade for in isolation, but maybe as like a utility outfielder in a general deal with the Phillies. Christopher Sanchez, solid bottom rotation left-handed starting pitcher most of the time. Costs very little to pick up. That's pretty much about it with him. Nick Nelson, same thing, except a right-hander, a little bit better overall ratings. But yeah, pretty much the same as Sanchez. And Andrew Painter. This is one of the things that I find very odd in OTP. Just like Chase Petty, just like I forget his name, the Yankees prospect. Andrew Painter is surprisingly cheap to pick up, just like Dax Fulton. I mean, all of these starting pitching prospects who are really high end, just not tough to trade for. I mean, it's not like Andrew Painter's talent is any kind of surprise. He's the number 6 prospect in baseball. He's got ridiculous stuff, movement, and control. He's developed enough to be a starter right now, and yet he is not expensive to give up. I mean, look at what I'm giving up for him, essentially. It's nothing, and I'm getting a giant package of other players, albeit much less talented back. But Andrew Painter is, to me, one of OTP's best prospects right now. And he's 20. He's almost fully developed. His velocity has room to grow. There's a lot to like here. For relatively low cost of acquisition, he's just a ridiculously talented player. McKinley Moore. Middle reliever, potential to grow out some more, but unlikely. So you're pretty much just picking him up for a very low cost acquisition to be a solid middle reliever. Griff McGarry's an interesting player. He's a near fully developed starting pitcher, very solid stuff, okay movement, and below where you'd like to see it control. But regardless, he can step in towards the bottom of your rotation and be pretty effective from the get go. Relatively low cost of acquisition, just an interesting player. And last, we got Andrew Baker, who is like McKinley Moore, just a middle reliever with a little bit of potential that he's unlikely to grow into. Very low cost of acquisition, just a decent player in general. Anyways, with that, we will go ahead and move on to our next team. All right, with the Pittsburgh Pirates, there are not a lot of players that are significantly undervalued, but there are certainly some interesting ones. First off is Nick Gonzalez, who, as I mentioned a lot, second base is a relatively difficult position to find quality starters at. He's not a bad opening day starter at second base. The defense isn't terrible. His personality is obviously pretty good. Bat's not bad. It's probably approaching major league average. The big thing about Gonzalez is that he does have a touch of upside in him. If he can develop into his full bat, he's a solidly above average hitter, although obviously not too much hope there at almost 24 years old. Next up, we got Matt Gorski, who's a really interesting player. He's actually, to me, one of the more unique players in OTP right now. I mentioned earlier how I like Seth Brown because he's one of the few fully developed, quality, above average corner outfielders you can get for next to no cost. Matt Gorski, very similar, except his strength comes instead of from having a great bat to having a great glove. I mean, he does have a solid bat. I would say he's about a major league average, maybe slightly below major league average hitter. He's got good base running, but really that glove is very impressive. He is a solidly above average right fielder. Now, I wouldn't quite say cold glove caliber, but he's going to give you some good value on defense. So if you're looking for someone who can patch up your defense more and then you're looking for a great hitter like Seth Brown, Matt Gorski is someone you're probably going to be interested in. And last on our list is one of the weirdest players in OTP to be undervalued to me, and somebody I've been trading for in literally every single start that I'm making right now, and that is O'Neal Cruz. Now, Cruz is obviously not a shortstop given this defensive profile. However, he is a solidly above average third baseman, especially with the big time arm, which is actually one of the better arms in all of OTP right now. I wouldn't quite say he's in the upper echelon of third base defense, but he's certainly quite good there. And his bat, again, he's approaching 25. It's unlikely that he fully develops. But he does, even as it stands, have a pretty strong bat. And if he improves just a little bit, he's a solidly above average hitter with solidly above average defense and decent base running. So ultimately, O'Neal Cruz, for literally no cost of acquisition, is one of the best players to trade for in OTP today. Now, that said, Pirates really don't have too much else of value to trade anyways, and they're not really willing to trade most of their other players. So that's about it that they have, and we will go ahead and move on. All right, with the Padres, the big thing is prospects, prospects, prospects. There's a lot of prospects here that are heavily undervalued. I'm actually going to start with two that I wasn't able to fit into this trade by this size limit of 10 players. And the first of those is going to be Zach Keen. Now, he isn't necessarily the greatest prospect ever, pretty much average overall capabilities, even once you factor in his velocity, probable velocity TCR. But the big thing is that young players like this, and I'm pretty much talking about him for the express purpose of discussing young players, have the potential to become greater than most players that are older, especially when they're a little bit more developed for their age, like Keen is. So if you see players like this, you can get them for relatively cheap. It's pretty much the lottery ticket philosophy. If you're not giving up anything of value, you might as well take a shot on a youngster. The second player is Edui Rosario, and I hope I came close on that. Another third baseman with pretty solid bat. I would say average to above average. He's an average hitter right now with above average potential. Strong base running, solid third base defense. Can be a utility infielder as well if needed. Minimal cost of acquisition, probably due to his injury, but overall solid player. All right, and as for the players in this trade, Adrian Morejon is going to be the first one, and he is a pretty cheap starting pitcher. Really, the big thing here is, once again, cost of acquisition. He's a bottom rotation starting pitcher, but the big thing with him is he does have more upside than a vast majority of the bottom rotation pitchers for his cost range. And he is a lefty. So as he is, he's actually one of the better players of this type anyways. And of course, if he does make gains towards his full stuff of 75, he quickly becomes a really truly amazing value at a very low to no cost. Next up is Michael Baez, who's perennially on this list. This year more so as a reliever than a starter because his movement and control don't quite hold up as well as a starter, I think, this year. The big thing with Baez is that he is a very good reliever. He does have that stamina. He can start if you want him to, although he's obviously more effective as a reliever. He costs next to nothing to get. We've got Jose Cantillo, who's yet another left-handed reliever with solids or very strong stuff, solid movement, and okay control. Costs nothing to get. Middle reliever, very good. Nabil Crismat, who is, in my eyes, not only one of the more undervalued players in OTP in terms of how the engine values him, but just one of the most interesting players in the game overall. He has really solid stuff movement and control as a starting pitcher, costs next to nothing to get, can be extended for incredibly cheap. And in general, he's just probably the most valuable starting pitcher in a very long time who isn't really considered a starter by the game and isn't even considered as good a reliever as he truly is by the game. Even if he was restricted as a reliever, he'd still be a good cost or a good acquisition for his price. But as a starting pitcher who costs nothing to get, is truly an upper middle rotation starting pitcher and costs nothing to extend if you want to go that route with him. He's incredible value. Next up, we got Drew Pomeranz, who you can acquire primarily as a contract eat. $8 million 1 year, although he's not a bad middle reliever when he comes back. He is a lefty. He's got strong stuff. The movement and control aren't too bad. So ultimately, a pretty solid acquisition. He makes some other players get cheaper, such as Robbie Snelling. Now, Snelling's a 19-year-old pitcher with a strong stuff, movement, and control potential, and he's reasonably developed for his age. He's obviously in more of a second tier compared to guys like Chase Petty and Andrew Painter, but he is certainly one of the better starting pitching prospects in all of baseball right now, or all of OTP, I should say, right now, at a minimal cost of acquisition for his talent level, at least. Samuel Zavala is a very strong corner outfield prospect with good defensive potential and good bat potential. But beyond that, you also have to look at his age. He's not even 19 yet, and he's pretty well developed. So there's certainly potential for him to exceed his current potential or apparent potential batting ratings. So Zavala is certainly one of the more intriguing batting prospects in all of OTP as well, and at a very cheap cost relative to his talent. Angel Felipe, a middle reliever who costs next to nothing, quality stuff and movement. Same thing with Jose Lopez. And then Joshua Mears, who's a corner outfield prospect with a solid above average bat potential. He is 22, so he actually, as opposed to a lot of players with this type of player in general, he does have the potential to hit his apparent potential ratings. So Mears a solid player. Anyways, that's going to do it for the Padres, so we'll go ahead and move on. With the Giants, there's a number of interesting players here comparatively to look at. So first up, we got RJ Dabovich, a relief prospect who's probably not going to hit his potential, but regardless is a cheap to get, solid middle reliever with good stuff, solid movement, and developing control. Next, we got Grant McCray, who's a center fielder with a little bit more of offensive potential if you want to go that route. He's 22, so again, the probability that he hits his offensive potential, which is probably approximately an average major league hitter, is not too bad. He's also got pretty good base running, so you get that bonus to the offense as well. Worst case scenario, he's a utility outfielder and a very good one at that, with solid defense, solid base running, solid batting. His cost of acquisition isn't too high, but keep in mind he's probably going to be a little higher than some other options for center field. Averson Ortega is actually one of my favorite prospects in OTP at the moment. The shortstop defense is a little bit lackluster, but worst case, he's still a very good second baseman and can develop into a shortstop with a little bit of fortune. Now, his bat is very well developed for his age of only 20, so you're looking at a guy who's quite likely to outperform his potential expectations relative to most prospects at least, and become an average to above average MLB hitter with very strong defense and a minimal cost of acquisition for his talent. Patrick Bailey is an enigma to me because, as I've said repeatedly, catchers are very difficult to trade for in most cases. They're not cheap players. But Patrick Bailey is one of the few guys with 65 or better catcher ability, which is really the baseline I'm setting for a strong defensive catcher in 24 with reduced defense. And he's got a near MLB average bat. He's young, he's controllable, he's cheap, his personality's solid, and he costs next to nothing to get. So very weird to me, but Patrick Bailey's certainly a valuable player right now. Cole Waite's another middle reliever, high stuff, solid movement, lower control, very cheap to get. Logan Webb, he's a little bit on the lower end of high value players, but he is one of the better starting pitchers in OTP and doesn't quite cost it. He is more of a middle rotation, upper middle rotation price than a true ace cost. So he's kind of like, I would compare him to a cheaper Brandon Webb, or excuse me, not Brandon Webb, Brandon Woodruff, in that he is a very good high caliber starting pitcher that you're going to go for generally if you need someone to fill that role for your team. Alex Cobb, another good middle rotation starting pitcher, or you can move into the bullpen if you like. He's not that expensive. 1 year, $9 million, and the Giants think he's a horrible net negative value. I think he's frankly, if anything, undervalued at his price. So I would be trading for him in a vacuum, but he's a very good starting pitcher for the middle rotation, in my opinion, at this moment. Next up, we got Tyler Rogers and Scott Alexander, two very similar players. They're both much stronger against their same handedness. They're both somewhat cheap relievers who are quality middle relievers in general, and the Giants think they're a huge negative value. So if you throw in Cobb, Rogers, and Alexander, getting Logan Webb is not hard. As you can see, I pretty much got him for Slade Ciccone in this case with those four players all together. So lots of value to be had in making a trade with the Giants right now. All right, next up is the Seattle Mariners, and there's certainly a lot to go through here, but mainly with their first and best player, Matt Brash, who is quite possibly the most underrated player in out of the park baseball as of today, and in my opinion, one of the best starting pitchers in all of OTP as well. Now, the biggest thing here is his ginormous stuff, which is 95 and borderline 85 as a starter. As a starter, he also has incredible movement and solid control. He compares with everything but the control to all of the best starting pitchers in OTP, and he costs about the same as a middle rotation starter. So to me, Matt Brash is just ridiculously underrated right now. An absolute must have in every single game. Definitely my favorite player to pick up. Next up is Cal Raleigh, who I think it's also very weird how cheap he is considering the cost of most catchers. He brings to the table not only solid catcher defense with that 65 mark that I'm looking for in a lot of my catchers, he also brings some pretty good batting, above average overall batting skills as a switch hitting catcher. So Cal Raleigh, for a price of a relatively low price at that, certainly a quality addition. Next up, we got Jared Kelenic, who has become somewhat of a forgotten prospect for many, but still quality player in OTP with an above average bat, above average glove in the corner outfield, good solid personality. He's not 24 yet. He's got good base running. Everything's good about Kelenic. He compares very well to a lot of similar players, these corner outfield types. He's an above average player who costs very little pickup. Bryce Miller, a decent reliever starter, swingman type player who is relatively low cost. Cost of acquisition is definitely the big thing with him. Marco Gonzalez, obviously not a good player. You might even release him immediately upon acquiring him. Big thing though is that he only has 2 years on his contract. Year one barely even registers as important at 6.5. Second year is 12. Third year is obviously a buyout you're going to take. But the Mariners think he's horrible value, so generally a good way to bring down the cost of any trade made with them. Taylor Trammell is on this list because he's a captain. He's a viable utility outfielder. Obviously, less defense than you'd like to see from utility outfielder, but solid bat and solid base running. And obviously, that captain personality gives him a nice bump in the value. Costs very little, if anything, to get most of the time. Tom Murphy, kind of like Cal Raleigh, very weirdly underrated. He's a solid catcher, frankly. He's not a bad starting catcher and an excellent backup if you want to pick him up in the same deal as Raleigh. Leader, not horrible defense, solid batting profile. Evan White, a lot like Marco Gonzalez. You're trading for him because his contract's not that expensive, but the Mariners seem to treat it as such. You can train him up to be a corner outfielder where he's not too bad. He's probably about an average, below average type player with his defense. He's not a horrible utility guy. If you want to use him in that role as well, first base utility outfield type player. Taylor Dullard is an interesting pitching prospect. He does theoretically have the potential to be a solid middle rotation guy. Is obviously one of those guys you pick up to be a bottom rotation starter at a low price who has a little upside if you can get there on a little bit of a stroke of luck. And Isaiah Campbell, the middle reliever on this list, who is here because he has no cost of acquisition and is a solid middle reliever overall. All right, anyways, we will go ahead and head on to the next team now. With the St. Louis Cardinals, there are two players where it's not about cost of acquisition, and then the rest is entirely about cost of acquisition. First two are Jordan Walker and Teak Hentz, who are two of the best prospects in OOTP at the moment. Jordan Walker, very heavily developed, almost 21-year-old hitting prospect, one of the best corner outfielders in the game at the moment. Brings incredible power and an overall very well-rounded, very high-quality batting profile to the table. Tink Hentz, who's one of the most refined pitching prospects in the game at 20, almost 21 years old. Very good arsenal overall. Room to grow as well. Now, they're not cheap. They cost you a couple big players to get, but at the same time, these two guys are ginormous prospects, and considering that it doesn't actually take that much in retrospect to get them, it'd be very valuable acquisitions. Joshua Baez, pretty much no cost of acquisition for a 19-year-old with good development and solid outfield defense. You also got Andre Palante, who is an incredible starting pitcher in the same mold as Matt Brash, although albeit a little bit worse. Big time movement, solid control and stuff as a starter. Costs very little pickup, so more of a middle rotation type guy. Packy Naughton, bottom rotation left-handed starting pitcher who's cheap to get, and Zach Thompson, another bottom rotation type left-handed starting pitcher who's pretty cheap to get, although probably a little bit better than Packy Naughton. Anyways, that'll be it for the Cardinals, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next team. Next up is the Tampa Bay Rays, and there's a couple of interesting players, mostly pitchers here. First off is Jeffrey Springs, who's a pretty popular player in real life right now in terms of what he's expected to do for this season, coming off a pretty good year. And big thing here is actually the talent, not so much the cost of acquisition, although he is a very affordable player on his contract as well. Very good left-handed starting pitcher, middle rotation type, not super expensive, though he will cost a little bit. Jalen Beeks is kind of in the same mold as the Astros reliever from earlier, whose name I forget because I have a short memory. I'm going to go find it real quick because that's going to bother me. It was Brian Abreu I'm trying to think, or was trying to think of, except he has more control. So Beeks is a really well-rounded player, very excellent talent to pick up at this point, relatively cheap. Your choice of back-end stopper pretty much, or pretty good middle upper rotation starting pitcher, since he is perfectly capable of doing so. But ultimately a very quality talent to pick up. Jose Siri, cost of acquisitions next to nil. He's pretty much just a worse Brett Phillips, and the cost is certainly very affordable for him. So one of the more affordable center field options. Taylor Walls, second baseman, good base running, decent bat, switch hitter, decent defense at second base. Pretty much the works for a very cheap to get second base option. Can play utility infield as well. Kevin Kelly, no cost to acquire, pretty much middle relief type. Heriberto Hernandez, very solid first base prospect offensively. So if you're looking for a hitter type, he's certainly one worth picking up. Graham Stinson, another middle reliever who costs nothing to get, and Colby White, same deal, middle reliever who costs you pretty much nothing to get. All right, anyways, we were going to go ahead and move on. I believe the Toronto Blue Jays are our next team. I was actually incorrect about the next team is going to be the Texas Rangers. First up, we got Mitch Garver, who as an offensive catcher is probably only second to probably honestly the number one, now that I'm thinking about it, offensive catching option in terms of affordability. He brings well above average offense to the table with good power and eye. He's not the worst defender anymore either, 55 ability now. He's not too expensive and comes at a low price to acquire relative to a lot of catchers. Leody Taveras is an interesting one. As a center field, he's more affordable and brings more offense than most, boasting a potentially league average bat with a touch more development, although he is 24, so don't count on it. But his center field defense is obviously potentially a little bit lackluster, so I consider more of a utility outfield option at this point. Martin Perez, starting pitcher, he's not a bad middle rotation pitcher, frankly. He's not bad to acquire for just the purpose of being a starter. But he costs nearly $20 million, and the Rangers see that as a big no-no. So if you're looking to make a deal and looking to drop the cost, Perez is a good way to do it. Bubba Thompson, another center field option. He's a lot like Leody Taveras in a number of ways. A little bit more expensive to acquire usually, though. Jonathan Hernandez, middle relief option, who's cheap to get. Brett Martin, middle relief option, who they actually think is a negative value, presumably because of his injury, but he's good lefty, solid pickup a lot of the time. Antoine Kelly, another middle reliever who can actually develop into a starter with a little bit of fortune. Unlikely though with the control to actually work out there, but very little really acquisition cost. And Chase Lee, another middle reliever who costs next to nothing. Anyways, next up will actually be the Toronto Blue Jays. All right, for the Toronto Blue Jays, there is not really quite as much, but there is a good quantity of players. First up is Kevon Biggio, who's probably my favorite player from the team right now. He's capable of being a super utility player slash captain, starting second baseman, starting corner outfielder, pretty much whatever you need. He brings approximately league average offense, solid base running, and competent defense at a lot of different places. He's affordable, but obviously the personality is the big draw with him, and of course, a very low cost of acquisition. Next up is Adam Simber, who the Blue Jays view as a slight negative. He is very good versus right-handed pitchers, or batters rather, and is a solid middle reliever pickup. Brandon Eisler, another solid middle reliever pickup with next to no acquisition cost. Hayden Danner, another higher potential middle reliever, pretty much a flyer. You pick him up as a middle reliever, hope that he improves. If not, he's still not bad. Orelvis Martinez, another third base option, cheap to acquire. Pretty solid batting profile for a young age, so he's got a much higher chance of fully turning out than most options, and potentially exceeding his potential as well. Ricky Tiedemann, in my opinion, is in the upper echelon of starting pitching prospects in OTP right now, but doesn't really get registered as such. I mean, he's pretty much on the Chase Petty, Andrew Painter level talent in terms of his age and overall abilities, but certainly does not seem to be worth that according to the Toronto Blue Jays. Although then again, those players aren't really worth too much either. Hayden Junger, another solid potential starting pitcher, a little less likely to hit his potential, but still solid middle relief future potential as a not bad current right now bottom rotation type pitcher. Jimmy Burnett, good middle reliever, very cheap acquisition cost, and of course with that borderline starting pitcher, just a little bit of development on this changeup or the sinker, and he could get there to a full starter. Slider also being his number one pitch is quite interesting to me. And last, we got Hyunjin Ryu, who is pretty much $20 million of dead money. I don't even think he's worth using as a bottom rotation starting pitcher right now. But he does make trades with the Blue Jays a whole lot easier. Getting Ricky Tiedemann in particular becomes a lot more simple when you've got Ryu coming back to you in the deal. Anyways, I believe next we got the Washington Nationals, the final team to cover on this series, and then we will go into the summary in the next episode. With the Washington Nationals, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of talent, but some very interesting players in a couple of spots here. First of which is going to be Cole Hendry, who is a very solid upper middle rotation type starting pitcher from the get go with very strong stuff, solid movement, solid control. Very minimal cost of acquisition for his talent compared to what you might expect. Victor Robles, who's pretty much just a cheaper center field option, not great offense, but solid defense. Victor Arano, a very affordable middle reliever type pitcher. Thad Ward, another solid bottom rotation starting pitcher with very low cost of acquisition. Patrick Corbin, who is a 1 year, $24 million hole pretty much. 2 years. So it's kind of questionable whether you should be trading for him or not, but he can reduce the price of any trade made with the Nationals. He's certainly more worth acquiring than some other options. Anyways, Armando Cruz is arguably the best shortstop prospect in all of OTP with his excellent defense and solid, although not obviously good offense. He does come very affordably despite his high end talent and is pretty much Nicky Lopez plus if fully developed. And last on the list, we got Jose Ferrer, who's yet another middle reliever that you can get for pretty much nothing. Anyways, guys, this is going to conclude each of the individual players, but there is one more set that we have to cover, the free agent pool. Now, there are so many free agents that I have on the list that I'm not going to bother to cover them all, so we're just going to hit a couple highlights. First of all is the highest potential free agent available, Yaiver Torrealba, or hopefully something close to that, a second baseman prospect at that, with very high power potential. He's almost certainly not going to reach. But you add him to your organization, you hope he develops a touch, and then he could be a good trade chip going forwards. Some players that you might actually consider to be viable to sign, Miguel Sano is probably the highlight. As I've said earlier in this video and the precursor videos, first basemen who can hit pretty well are actually not that common, and obviously you can play the outfield a little bit too with some solid ratings there. He not only hits, he brings some very prodigious power and a solid overall batting profile to boot. So Sano, if you're looking for a big bat in the lineup, is absolutely somebody to keep tabs on. Next up on the list is going to be Wilfredo Tovar, who is one of the better. Uh, Actually, it looks like he's going to be further down, so I'm going to cover Stephen Alamis next, who's one of the better defensive middle infield type players. If you need a utility infielder or a shortstop on the cheap, he is certainly someone to look into. Wilfredo Tovar, who's going to be down a little bit further, is going to be in that same boat of players, the very cheap second base shortstop type guys. And there's a good number of pitchers that you can get. There's a good number of fielders. There's a good number, well, not necessarily a good number of hitters that you can get as well. But there are obviously a couple, such as mentioned earlier, Miguel Sano. Anyways, with this, I hope that you guys have benefited from these videos. I hope that the summary is useful to those of you who do not want to spend an hour and a half plus 2 hours watching through the ridiculous length of the ridiculous number of undervalued players in the OTP world right now. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.